Again, thanks to our panelists for being here. Thanks to Will Summercorn, who's moderating this. Really looking forward to finding out what I missed on legislative update, what went on in Capitol Hill this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. All right. What I'll do here, just briefly, let me get this squared away. Sorry for all that noise. All right. We want to talk about what happened in the legislature this year, and give everybody a little bit of an update with regard to land use. There were a lot of other related issues as well, but we're going to focus on the land use issues and primarily for local government, cities and counties, and what is related there. So let me introduce our panelists to you really quickly. First, we have Todd Godfrey, who is a private attorney, but works with the League of Cities and Towns very closely. I don't know, what's your title exactly with the League?
What do you call me, Carson?
The legal guru for the League. Had a role in drafting a number of these bills, or at least in making sure that there was some good input that went with it. So we'll hear from Todd, who has some really good insights. Wade Budge, who is with the law firm of Snell and Wilmer. Is Snell and Wilmer, is that right? Wade is very active in the legislative arena as well. He deals a lot with making suggestions and drafting language and seeing what happens on some of these legislative bills as well. We were supposed to have Sean Guzman here, but Sean flaked out again, right, Jamie?
He had a conflicting meeting.
That's what happens when the conference is in your hometown, right? You always can find something that will interfere. Sean is a good friend. Years and years ago, when I was an associate professor, or just kind of working with up at the U in the planning program, and was teaching some basic planning courses, Sean was one of my students. He was one of the students in an introductory level planning course, and I've never let him forget it, and he's never let me forget it. And we always rib each other a lot about that, but it's really good to see. Sean has been the St. George City Attorney, and now he is, what is his title now, Jamie?
Government Affairs Director.
Government Affairs, and Jamie is in the St. George City Attorney's office now. Used to be in Summit County.
The notorious.
Which a lot happens in Summit County, and a lot happened with regard to the legislation this year dealing with Summit County as well. We'll talk maybe a little bit about some of that. And then we have Gary Crane up here. Gary is actually part of the next panel, the next session panel, but we've pulled him up here because Gary is the Layton City Attorney, and he has worked for many years on behalf of the League at the legislature. Somebody called him the legend, or the guru already, and I've been called that because I've been retired for a while now, and I've reminded Gary what that really means is that you're just old. You've been around too long, and so Gary acknowledges that as well, but Gary has some good insights on what's happened legislatively as well. We're going to bleed the two panels together, the one for now and then the next session, because the next session, it kind of follows on with one of the bills that was passed during the session, actually a couple of the bills. And we'll invite the other panelists up towards the end of this one and then just kind of bleed over and talk about the processes, and you'll see how that works. So I'm going to just introduce the topics here. We're going to go over this by topic, and then I'm going to throw it to our panel of legal experts and legislative experts, and they'll give you some insights and talk a little bit about it. And we're happy to take your questions as well. So as you may have questions about some of these bills as they come up. So many bills in this last legislative session. Personally, I don't recall having seen as many land use related bills as there were in this session before. We had I counted about 35 bills relating to land use issues that were introduced during the session, 19 of which passed. A number of those bills, we had no idea they were even coming. They were issues and things that were brought up and kind of surprised us all a little bit with what they were trying to do. But this is something I've been kind of saying for a while now, is that we are getting very into the weeds. The enabling legislation for planning and zoning at the local level, which is called the Land Use Development and Management Act, there's one for cities and one for counties, has been around for a while now, and it is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's kind of reminding me of, in Ghostbusters, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man that just grew huge. That's what's happening to the LUDMA, we call it, the Land Use Development and Management Act, the enabling legislation for local planning and zoning. It is getting bigger, longer, more complex, harder to understand. In this year's legislative session, we added 388 lines of code to the LUDMA. Last year, there was more than that added to the LUDMA. It's getting to the point where no one person really seems to be able to have a good handle on it. And when I mentioned this to Craig, I said the LUDMA is just getting really complex, and pretty soon it's going to take, nobody's going to be able to do anything without getting a legal expert or somebody to help walk them through it about what they need to know. And Craig's response was, well, we're just trying to make it like water law. And I think he may be right. But just be aware, and I have characterized this session as the Planners Full Employment Act, because there is so much that needs to be done at the local level, certainly, and at the state level as well, that's being required by these bills that are being passed. I had a good friend of mine who talked to me a few months ago, and he said he had a grandson who was graduating in urban planning from the University of Washington and would really like to come back to Utah. And he asked me, he said, do you think he'll be able to find a job in Utah? And I said, oh, no problem. We're going to need a lot of planners because of what's being required, what needs to be done. And you'll see that as we talk about some of this. A lot of what's being driven in the legislation deals with what we call zoning reform. Some people don't like that term, but really it's something that's been happening around the country, and a lot of it relates to the housing affordability crisis. The fact that housing has escalated so much and so rapidly that it's becoming increasingly difficult for people of modest incomes and even moderate incomes to be able to afford either buying a home or finding a place to even rent at times, because rents are getting so outrageously expensive as well. There are a lot of reasons for it. Local land use regulation seems to be a kind of a favorite target of a lot to say that's the reason for it. It is part of the reason. It's certainly not the entire reason. There are a lot of other factors that go into it, things like interest rates, the availability of construction labor and skills, the supply chain problems and the cost of materials for construction, a variety of factors. And land use, local land use regulation is certainly a factor in many locations. It's not the only factor. It may not even be the biggest factor, but it's certainly a factor. And it's one that's fairly easy to pick on. And so in many states around the country, you see these efforts of what's been going on for the last few years that gets characterized as zoning reform. Essentially what that means is eliminating single-family zoning or reducing single-family zoning a lot and allowing for more types of housing to be built in more places. That has certainly had some impact or some effect here in the state of Utah. But Utah has been somewhat different. In many other states, it really becomes kind of a top-down approach. The state saying to the locals, okay, you're going to have to allow duplexes and triplexes and townhouses in all of your residential zones. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's been talked about here in the state of Utah, but there actually has been a pretty good level of cooperation between the state level officials and the local officials to take an approach that's more collaborative. And so we're seeing that continue here. So it's Cameron Deal, the executive director of the League of Cities and Towns here in the state of Utah, has told me and told others that he gets a lot of calls from other leagues around the country, municipal associations and leagues, asking what's happening in Utah? Why is it so different? Why are we not getting the same top-down mandates that so many other states seem to be seeing? And it's the Utah way, maybe we call it. I don't know. But it's something that has been going on for a couple of years at the legislative level, and I think it will continue for a while yet. We're seeing a bit of an easing in the housing affordability crisis, but it's certainly not coming down, or not much, and it continues to be an issue, and something that I think we'll see continue to be addressed. So let's approach or talk about some of these bills that were passed in this legislative session, and let's do it by topic. The first one we'll talk about is moderate income housing. This has to do with the requirement that was put into place. Actually, the moderate income housing plan has been a requirement in the state code for a lot of years, but it did not have teeth to it initially, and a lot of places were pretty much ignoring it. But with the advent of the housing affordability crisis, more attention was paid to it. A couple of years ago, it was added to the general plan list of elements, the elements that you must include in a community general plan, moderate housing income elements, along with a variety of things that needed to be examined and looked at and considered in developing and adopting that element in your community general plan, and then a number of requirements about what you had to do, what communities had to do in terms of adopting and trying to do things, and then reporting. In this last legislative session, most of the changes that were made, and there were a number of changes made to this issue and to this topic, most of the changes that were made related to the reporting requirements, the ability to appeal when someone is considered to be non-compliant, and the penalties. Or the consequences that if you do not have a moderate income housing plan that passes state muster, essentially. So I'm going to throw it to our panelists and let them talk about this, the moderate income housing plans.
Who wants to go first?
Whoever.
The big emphasis in the session this year, like Will said, there have been requirements for cities and towns to put moderate income housing elements in their general plan for a number of years. It almost goes back to 2005 or 6.
Yes.
That requirement has been there for an extended period of time. In the session in 2021, there were some more stringent requirements on the plan that were adopted by the state. And the concern that has developed over what is obviously a very short period of time from the 2021 session until now is that we have the requirement to put these things in a general plan, but a general plan is a non-binding advisory document for every city and town. So you can put all sorts of aspirational things in your general plan, but effectively they mean nothing if you take no steps towards implementation. And the concern has been that that's exactly where we are. That cities and towns have moderate income housing elements in their general plan and they look great, but they aren't being implemented in any meaningful way. There's no follow-up from the general plan to an actual zoning practice or to anything else that works towards moderate income housing in a community. Obviously, there's a lot of public resistance to that notion. You've all heard about how difficult it is in our communities to get a community to buy into the idea of developing moderate income housing in a particular area. That has been a challenge. When the legislature sits in their seats and looks at what they do, they have certain levers they can pull, and some of those are the regulatory levers that govern land use, and that's what they're trying to do in this case. They're trying to push local government towards a place where their ordinances and their practices actually permit the development of moderate income housing. So the reporting that Will talked about isn't just, is your plan in place, it's what are you doing to implement your plan now? And that's a big step, and it's a significant difference that's happening on a legislative level to feel that push down from the top towards implementation of local practice. It is significant in a number of ways. I think it's going to take a few years, and I know in a housing crisis that's an uncomfortable statement. I think it's going to take a few years to see what this actually does to our situation here in Utah. But some of the things that have to be remembered are there are a lot of folks in this room who actually have the ability to build affordable housing. Those of you who may work for cities or towns aren't those people. Cities or towns don't build anything. All we can do is enable. And the legislature is wanting us at the highest level we can to enable more. And that's what the general plan part of the revisions are. And somebody is looking over cities' shoulders now. The Department of Workforce Services is looking over the city's shoulders. They're evaluating their plans actively. The city has to submit them every year, and the Department of Workforce Services is actually actively reviewing those plans now. In the past, I think the review has been, show us your plan, you have one, thanks. But now there's an active review. They're picking at details, and so the changes that have been made from 21 to now, pushing towards implementation, are actually really significant.
One of the things that, this was the year of no, we really mean it, like they talked about, because one of the things they did this year is put in some pretty heavy sticks, where, like Todd talked about in 2021, it was a turn in your plan and it was a pass-fail, but there was really no penalty for a fail. Now there are some penalties, and it comes in the form of state tax dollars and road money. And they're, the power of the purse is pretty strong, but that's really the threat that we've got now is you don't do it, you start losing some of your tax funding from the state, and that's kind of scary for local jurisdictions.
To kind of clarify, that was the way that it began, is that they were looking at the hammer of taking away B&C road funds from municipalities that did not conform or did not actually put in a plan, affordable housing plan. By the end of the session, what it ended up being is a penalty. And the penalty is $90,000 a year, or $250 a day for every day that we were in non-compliance. But the point is that you cannot come into compliance until the following year or the next year. So what they did was they put in a penalty. It's a monetary penalty. We're hoping that cities don't just say, we'll pay the penalty and move forward and not have multifamily housing within our jurisdictions. That's the hope that both the legislature has and those that negotiated this bill have. Because if that does happen, then I can see this we're going to make the stick bigger. In fact, before the end of the session, it was recommended that they multiply that by 10 times. So the penalty be 10 times the $90,000 a year for disobedience or not filing your plan, not having an acceptable and up-to-date plan. That we would not want. That's not the whole purpose of this. The whole purpose is to see if we can put together a plan that actually does something when it comes to evaluating and putting together efforts to accomplish affordable housing or housing affordability in the state of Utah. I can see this, though, going to those B&C road funds next year if we fail to get compliance. This year we had, it's interesting because the legislature will pass a bill and they'll give you a year to actually get it right. And if you don't get it right, which you never do by the first year, then they pass a new bill that changes it again. And then they'll pass another one the next year to change it again. And sometimes you just want to say, well, just stop for a moment, let us catch up. This last year, most of us submitted our affordable housing plans, and many of them were found to be in non-compliance for small things. And we ended up in straightening those out, and the bill that was passed this year actually compensated for a lot of those things and corrected a lot of those things. And so we're much more comfortable with where we stand today through 464 than we were at the very beginning of the process last year, because 70% of us got it wrong. The best advice I could give you is work very, very closely with the Division of Workforce Services from the very beginning in putting your plan together. They're very, very workable, but if you don't do it the way that they've designated that you do it, you're likely to get into trouble at the end of the year. For the development community, take advantage of the fact that there are those provisions in the affordable housing plans that may help you in the development of affordable properties or affordable homes. Take a look at what those are, because quite frankly, we're under a mandate and a responsibility to make sure that we accomplish the goals that we put in our plans now. They're not just wallpaper. They're things that we have to actively accomplish. And so if you take a look at it and see, oh, look, here we've got an area where it encourages turning large parking lots into smaller parking lots so that we can, put more affordable housing around. Take a look at those plans, and they may accommodate what you're doing in the development community, and you may be able to suggest solutions that will assist cities in being able to accomplish what they have in their plans. That's going to bode well for us when we go back to the Division of Workforce Services, because what's going to happen is they're going to take a look at it and say, look, you did accomplish some things. They not only want us to write it into the plan, but they want us to accomplish it. And so there's a synergy there that could take place between cities and development community. I think that's the hope, anyway. So.
I'd echo that last comment by Gary. I know we have a lot of other content to cover, so we'll keep moving along here. But from the development perspective, obviously there are two things that we like to see. One is the reporting, which Gary and Jamie and Todd have already talked about, and that has become more robust. But then also the set of incentives, because as we know, affordable housing doesn't come without the appropriate set of incentives, be they density or finding a place to put them, as I think Gary alluded, or as we're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation, there's a lot that's been done with respect to incentive zones. HTRZ comes to mind. You have also using other tools like a CRA or other items. And so as you're looking at handling this particular issue of bringing to the market affordable housing, those are the tools that all need to be looked at together.
There have been because this is such a big and involved area, there have been some other training sessions. The League has put together a training session that was held on March 29th that's available. You can view that on their website. Go there, under the spring training topics, and then they'll be addressing this again in their conference here in St. George in a couple of weeks. So it's a big issue. It's an area that's complex and needs a lot of work and understanding, and just be aware that there's a lot going on in this arena. Okay, let's move along and talk about, we have a number of other items that we can cover, probably some of them briefly. While we're talking about the elements of the general plan, let's stay with that topic of the general plan modifications. The legislature in the last couple of sessions also put in some requirements for those who have transit station areas or transit stations. They were required to adopt what are called transit station area plans. And there's some very specific requirements and deadlines that those communities have to meet for that. There were some additional changes made to that in this legislative session, so if you fall into that category, take a look. Last session, the legislature also adopted another element that you have to include in your general plan for your community. It's called the water use and preservation element. It is very long and detailed about what you need to look at as you develop that. And there is a deadline for you to have that adopted into your general plans. So if you're not aware of that, you need to go and take a look at that and get to work on it. One of the things that happened in this legislative session is that there was a provision added to it that says that a community must consult with the State Division of Water Rights in the preparation of that element. So they're going to be busy because there's a lot of communities and they all have to do this. And so there's going to be plenty to deal with there, but all communities are now required in the preparation of that element to consult with the Division of Water Rights. Counties are additionally required to consult with the water providers in their counties and with agricultural interests in their counties. And that makes some sense because agriculture uses about 80% of the state's water. And so if we're going to achieve any meaningful conservation or preservation of water, agriculture needs to be part of that discussion. And so in the preparation of those plan elements in counties, they must consult with those interests. And then there was a provision added that requires that whenever you do a comprehensive update of your general plan, you must submit it to your local association of government, your AOG, within 45 days of adopting that general plan, that comprehensive general plan update. Any of our panelists want to address any of these? Gary?
Just maybe a wise thing to do during the course of this conference is to develop a checklist of all the things the legislature is going to require you to do within 45 days, within 10 days, within 20 days, that type of thing. Because there really are a lot of deadlines that the legislature imposed in the interest of what Jamie says, that saying we're serious about this.
Yeah, and that's why I called this the Planners Full Employment Act. There's a lot to be done, a lot that needs to be done that's now in the requirements. The subdivision approval process, we're going to wait and hold off till the end of this session, and we're going to blend it with the session that follows right after this, because it kind of involves the process of doing development approvals. And so we'll talk in more detail about what happened with this bill and then about the development approval process at the local level in general. So hang on to that. We'll be coming back to this. That includes as well some of these development standards. Do we want to address any of these now, or do we want to wait for that until the later discussion on these development standards, like the 32-foot pavement requirement for subdivision streets?
Happy to.
Well, let's do it now. Let's talk about that now. So there was a lot of discussion at the legislature about trying to make perhaps some of the development standards for subdivisions and for other development more uniform. A lot of resistance at the local level with regard to that, but there were some requirements that were put into place, and you can see what some of those are here about the residential roadways, about water rights exactions, and also landscaping and what you can require to be bonded for on the way of landscaping. So with that, let me throw it to our panelists and address any of these.
So the development community's had a concern that a number of cities and counties will require a road that is way too wide in terms of, if you have a road that's devoted only for residential use, it's not a through road, not an arterial or a road connecting to a larger area, but rather truly the quintessential local road, that you'll have a road width that's so wide that you're losing the ability to locate lots. And some may say, well, that just looks like you're coming from a profit perspective, but in reality, what you're trying to do is make sure that you're using wise use of land. And so the development community came and suggested, yeah, so the item, there we go, we have an opinion. So one of the issues that came forward is there was a working group. I was actually not involved with the working group, but I was in a number of the later meetings. And it was suggested that we lower the standard to around 26 feet in road width. There are a number of towns in this state that have roads that are even narrower than that, are very successful, are able to provide services, and those towns are thriving. The municipalities came back with a different perspective, saying for a variety of reasons they wanted to have the standard be a higher standard, and where the legislation ended up, as Wolf indicated, was 32 feet. One thing to think about with respect to that is when you're creating a roadway, you're creating really something to be maintained and on a go-forward basis. And one of the things you need to be thinking about is, are we requiring more than what's needed in order to provide that community feel and to provide that that ability for people to access their home? And if you have when you go ahead and dedicate a plat and you create that road surface, you're taking that particular item of land out of the tax rolls, and you're also making it so you can't put as much density in that particular area. So is 32 feet the right level? We'll see. I mean, my sense is that these things continue to get tweaked each and every year, and as more and more inputs are provided, those standards may adjust. But before I take the question that's over here, there is a series of exceptions within the statute, and so the 32 feet is not a hard and fast rule in every situation. So for instance, if you have a roadway that is greater than 25 feet in width, greater than 25 miles per hour, then it can be wider to accommodate that higher speed. But if you have a road that's really truly quintessentially local and 25 miles per hour or less, then the maximum standard would be, not the maximum, but the minimum standard that they can impose on you would be the 25 feet. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a question, because a lot of the small towns and actually a
32
lot of the
feet,
large
sorry.
towns all have
32.
grids, right? A block. I walked uptown last night and I thought, man, 100-foot wide streets, wow, isn't that something? But a lot of those areas are residential, okay? And so are we allowed to continue the grids as it broadens out the town or not? Or is that down to 32 feet?
I think right now, if it's, like Wade said, what they're mandating is that if it's purely residential, not an arterial or collector road or anything like that, then they have now set a state standard. We've been fighting this fight from the local level against the development community for, 5 years now?
Yeah, at least.
Because, along the Wasatch Front, as development goes from one town to the next, I mean, they're packed together. And you may have one standard in Harriman that's right next to Riverton that's a different standard, and it was difficult for the development community to meet those standards in the same development that may cross boundaries. But there's an element of local control here. And that's what's, the roads here in St. George aren't going to be the same standards as the roads in Park City. We don't have to worry about where the snow goes when we plow it. They do. We don't have, the asphalt depth isn't going to be the same. And from the governmental side, we've been pushing back that really this is a community standard that needs to be set, not necessarily a statewide one-size-fits-all. I still believe that. And I think that this is the first step into this statewide standard kind of mode. We'll see how it works, but 32 feet seems to be, and this is, again, it's not the width of the right-of-way itself, it's just the pavement.
That's right.
Is 32 feet, is the maximum, unless you have other needs. If you're gonna be a complete street with bike paths and everything else, then it can be wider, or if you're gonna be doing other things, but again, there's this battle between local control and a statewide standard in the development.
Just a real quick note, in my opinion, over the years that I've been up at the legislature, the Zoning Enabling Act has always been a zoning enabling act. But more and more, they're recognizing, and we're recognizing too, that sometimes costs are exponential when you allow cities to just do whatever they arbitrarily would do for arbitrary reasons. The developers are looking for two things. They're looking for perhaps lower cost, that's a given, but they're also looking for a standard. In other words, as you go from one jurisdiction to the other, they don't want to, one is 100 feet wide and the other one's 32 feet wide or 26 feet wide. And there didn't seem to be a justification for the difference. And so what they have moved more towards, and they've told us, when I say they, I'm talking about the PRC, the Property Rights Coalition, which is a group of developers that involves about 80% of the developers of residential property in the state. And they're the folks that join with us in a thing called the Land Use Task Force, and we try to resolve these issues. But what they've said is that this is the first step. We want to go to water lines, we want to go to stormwater, we want to go to these other items as well in future years. So let's see if we can work this one out. And if we can work streets out, that's the first step in maybe standardizing more things. Now that's to be seen as to whether or not that can be done, because streets was a battle all the way up until the last day of the legislative session, and the fire marshals, yeah, that's correct. 46 is there 26. They wanted 25. No, Chris Grambulis wanted 25, and I don't even know how you get a garbage truck down 25. But anyway, you do. By the way, you can. No parking on one side, no sidewalk, that type of thing. But literally, just at a very, very high level, this is the type of thing that they're looking at changing over the next few years, is to try and standardize those things. And the significance of the 32 feet and setting a standard in state law is that the burden now shifts to the cities to demonstrate why that ought to be larger. And if we can't demonstrate that, there's a possibility of an excessive exaction claim, which means that you have claimed more than you reasonably need as a city for this road. And an excessive exaction claim would be expensive for cities to fight, quite frankly, if they don't have any justification for enlarging it beyond the state standard. So that's the significance of setting a state standard.
And I just have one more comment, Wilf, on that. You know, Wilf at the beginning of his presentation talked about the Utah Way. If you go and look at other states, they are mandating development. You'll recall that all zoning originates from the state, it doesn't originate from cities. And so the Utah Way is to avoid having these heavier mandates come in place. And so what we're trying to do is find where there are those particular pinch points, let's find where we can come up with an agreement. Obviously, we wanted 26 or 25 feet, and we erred on the side of more, but the idea is to work together to try and find those equilibrium points in order to avoid falling into the place where all of a sudden single-family zoning is no longer the default. You have de facto multifamily in any residential zone, as is happening in a number of other states.
Now, I know that we're, approaching deadline time here to get on to the next issue, but, the legislative stuff's fairly of interest to everybody. Todd, could I just have you briefly address the landscaping bonding, what happened there?
Yeah, about 10 years ago, the state adopted some requirements and restrictions on when a city can require a bond from a developer or an applicant to finish public improvements, streets, utility lines, storm drain infrastructure, water, those kind of things. What got, I think, sort of missed in that whole calculation was the idea of sort of a quasi-public improvement that is not dedicated to the city eventually and that is located on private property. We see a lot of large developments that we call planned unit developments where the streets may be private, but there are large internal open space parcels or private parks within those spaces. And customarily cities, not all cities, but some cities have required a developer to bond for some of that private infrastructure to assure that it gets completed for the residents who are moving in. We've had circumstances where you have those planned in a project, people will buy a house thinking there's going to be a great big pretty park behind me, even though it's not public, it's going to be one I can use. And then when a developer's done building their houses, they're gone. And that's not the norm, but it happens. And a city's left with a bunch of residents who are upset that their park never got built and the city doesn't have the means to do it and there's no financial source to get it done. So a number of cities did bond for those private improvements. That's become a big source of contention between government and the development communities. And I'm just going to be candid in saying I think they won the fight from the development standpoint. I think they won this fight. And what the new law says is a city cannot require a bond for private landscaping. So there's a very limited exception for that for landscaping along public trails that lead to other public infrastructure, but cities can no longer require landscaping bonds on private property type areas. So there have been cities all across the state, not very many, but enough that I could count them and it would take two hands, that have required landscaping bonds to assure that the landscaping was put in a front yard. That's not an authorized practice anymore. If a city wants to see bonding to assure that a large open space parcel gets landscaped in some fashion, they're going to have to do that through an agreement form rather than just requiring it of a developer now. So this was I was surprised going into the session at I guess I would call it the vehemence from the development community on this issue. They showed us numbers about what sort of these landscaping bonds can cost in some circumstances, and they're, I acknowledge they're significant, but we're going to see situations now from a governmental perspective where we're going to be evaluating pretty hard whether we're very excited about a big open space parcel in the middle that we can't count on being landscaped and prepared appropriately, and how we evaluate those things.
She was grabbing, and I grabbed.
I was just gonna say.
Sorry about that.
So for the local jurisdictions, I will say, and Todd's right, I mean, to some degree, this was a win for the development community. But there are other mechanisms that I think will still work, and Wade and I have worked on these before. And that is, if you've got developments, whether it's multifamily or maybe you've got an incentive density project or whatever, where they are required to put in some amenities like a park, like trails, like everything else, it's about how you time those. And if you require some of them up front, or whether you can only pull so many permits before the park is needed, if the development community doesn't want to necessarily do that, then they will come to you, or you can have those kind of bonds, amenity bonds. Those are still allowed to guarantee the installation of these amenities that come in with the project. So it's a matter of how you structure that and how you time that in the development approval.
So does that come in your conditions agreement, the new development agreement?
Well, you don't use development agreements if it's just a regular approval, but yeah, it's a condition of approval that you know, you only get X number of permits before you have to build this amenity. And then you can build this many more before you have to build this amenity. Or maybe you have to build something up front before you pull a permit.
Just want to make sure.
And so it's a matter of timing in that development approval.
Gary.
Oh, sorry.
Just real quickly, be sure to add that into your ordinance,
Yes, please.
Yeah.
because we're gonna talk a little bit later about the fact that you have to, if it meets your ordinance, you have to approve it, so make sure it's in your ordinance. It may be subject to a development agreement if you've got the criteria for a development agreement. In other words, you're giving something, the city's giving something, that may be a good place for it, but if it's just a regular subdivision, make sure in your subdivision ordinance you say that you can approve only so many units without that improvement being made.
Question here.
What about limiting individual lots based upon a certificate of occupancy? Is that a problem?
That's a problem.
That's a problem.
Yep. You identified a problem.
Can you repeat? It's for online.
Is it a problem to have landscaping, or have a certificate of occupancy be a trigger point for individual lot landscaping?
It is.
Yeah, so certificate of occupancies can only be withheld if there's a life safety item. So for instance, if an improvement that's needed isn't there. And so they tried to put it onto like the building side of the code as opposed to the planning side. But, you know, to Jamie's point and Gary's, I think where you really have the opportunity to try and achieve that kind of phasing or making sure that development's proceeding in a fashion where those other things that you want to see put in place are there is to use the set of incentives. When you're in the incentive world of either bonus density or you're financing some aspect, the cities have a very free hand in that world.
I've had folks ask me a question about landscaping, for instance, a detention basin and certificates of occupancy based on that. I view that, you know, that detention basin may be owned by an HOA, an owners association of some kind. There may be an easement for the city. I'm taking the position on those things that that's not a landscaping improvement, that's an infrastructure improvement. If it's part of my storm drainage system, that's an infrastructure improvement, and I can require bonding for that, and I can time COs based on its installation, right? That's a health safety thing. So some of these things might bleed together, but the traditional front yard landscaping bond, you gotta have your grass in, you gotta have one tree, you gotta have, we can't do that anymore. And the statute is explicit about not being able to withhold COs based on that.
Yeah.
So,
All right, I'm going to move us along because we really want to spend more time on the really impactful bill, which was the subdivision process, which we'll get to. But I'm just going to quickly run through these. We're not going to spend really much time on this in the interest of time. Just be aware of these. The state, the bills that were passed now include any area that's within 5,000 feet of an airport runway, and the airport is defined as being something that's recognized by the state and may get state and federal funding. You must adopt an airport overlay and influence zone for the area within 5,000 feet of a runway, so be aware of that. If you're within 5,000 feet of a military facility, and they're defined in the state code as places like Camp Williams, Hill Air Force Base, Tooele Army Depot, some of the others, you must have a military land compatible use. It calls it a plan in the legislation, whoops. But that is, oh, there we are. That's not the right term. It's an actual land use regulation. It's a zone. in essence. So you must have that if you're within 5,000 feet of a military facility. And you are required to submit all land use applications other than application for just a single building permit to the State Division of Veteran and Military Affairs for their review. And they have 90 days in order to accomplish that review to approve whether that land use application can go forward or not. So be aware of that. There is a standardization of all kinds of mobile businesses, including food trucks. The health standards still, of course, apply to those. They wouldn't apply to things like scissor sharpening and haircuts and whatever else. But generally, as to where food trucks can go and the reciprocity of the business licensing and everything now applies to all mobile businesses, including food trucks, including ice cream trucks, including taco carts. It's all now uniform under this particular bill that was passed. And then for what's called the Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone, this mechanism that was put in place a couple of years ago by the legislature and was mandated to be put in place at a location in Summit County. There were some modifications made to that, so be aware of that. That into this bill was also inserted a provision that in essence what wound up entitling a specific developer on specific property in Summit County, which I've heard that of that kind of thing being threatened before in the legislature, but it never actually happened. It happened this year. They actually entitled development in a local jurisdiction at the legislative level. Never happened before. That's really unprecedented. Summit County has filed suit against both the developer and the state with regard to this. We'll see where that goes. Jamie, you want to say anything on that?
Yeah.
Jamie was in Summit County for a period of time.
Since I worked on the project in question, yes. Wilf's right. I mean, we've heard this threat for a while, but I'm astounded that it actually happened. This is a project in Kimball Junction that is already entitled. It's land that's already entitled. It's under a development agreement. They've got all their development rights under that development agreement. What happened is it sold to a new purchaser. They wanted to change those entitlements and amend the development agreement. And in working with the county, they were getting some serious pushback. They've had 2 public hearings with over 1,000 people in attendance and protest. Think of that, 1,000 people at your public hearing, guys. And so the county was really trying to vet this, and the change that they wanted in the existing development agreement, there's no residential uses, and that's the change that they wanted to put in as a residential use. That's the fight. They were in the process. It was still, there had never been a decision made yet on this amendment, and the developer went to the legislature and said, Summit County's being mean to me, give me my residential density, and the legislature granted it. And the lawsuit is over, that interference with the development agreement and contractual agreements and everything else, so.
Right. All right. Let's move on. Some of the other land use provisions, there were some changes made to the internal accessory dwelling unit, mainly having to do with the understanding of whether an attached garage qualifies as an internal dwelling unit. There were some clarifications made with regard to moratoriums. The term moratorium is not actually used in the state code. It applies to things, those of you who were here last night would have heard about this, a temporary land use regulation or a pending ordinance. Those are 2 different ways that you can implement some, what we generally call moratoriums, to do some things. Some jurisdictions were kind of stacking those so that instead of having the 1 6-month limitation, you were getting it to 12 or 18 months by actually kind of doing a little bit of back and forth on these different provisions. These provisions made clear you can only get 1 bite at the apple. You get 1 6-month time period in order to enact something different and get that moratorium to only last that period of time. There was some information about the clarification of development agreements. Todd may be able to address that here in a minute. There were some provisions talking about working animals and animal enterprises, not being able to restrict those unless they're part of a land use regulation. But the interesting thing of that is that part of it only applies to cities. It doesn't apply to counties where you're more likely to have working animals and animal enterprises. I think that was an oversight or a mistake in the legislative process, but anyway, there it is. There are provisions in the state code about urban farming and what's allowed and the benefits that may be accrued from urban farming or allowing urban farming. This bill says you at the local level get to decide what urban farming is. What does that include? So there was a provision about referenda. This particular bill took something that was done for the HRTZ zones and extended it to all land use regulations. So if a land use regulation at the local level is passed by a unanimous vote of the council, according to this bill, it cannot be subjected to a referendum.
Despite what the Constitution says.
Yeah, there's some real questions about, I mean, it's probably gonna take a legal challenge, but there's a real question that this will ever be able to
Yeah.
stand.
I mean, what's interesting on that, let me just speak to that. The referendum bill, Todd and I have lived the referendum hell before and together. And what's interesting is we now have a new Supreme Court. So I think it's an open question as to how they'll interpret it, because what the Constitution says is that the referendum rights can't be impinged, but they can be implemented in a way determined by the legislature. So there's a balance that has to occur. And as a result, you know, the initial draft was actually an ordinance that was 2/3, approved by 2/3 of the city council.
Yeah, that's for transit station areas.
Well, and that was actually going to be for all ordinances
It was,
as well.
that's
And
right.
then there was a hue and cry, and so they moved it up to be unanimous. And so the question is will that survive a legal challenge? The other question from the development perspective is, do you want to put all your eggs in that basket? Because you may get sued, and you'll have to then wait 3 years or more
Yeah.
to determine that. So it's still an open question. I don't know if you have anything else on that, Todd.
If I have a question like this, I'm advising one council member on my council to vote no. I don't want this fight. I can't wait for somebody to have it. I don't want it to be one of my clients.
And we may not want it either.
And then lastly, I want to just mention that, so there was this issue of what is called fractional ownership or co-ownership. It's where, you know, you sell a house, there are companies that'll buy houses and then they'll sell them to a number of different people. They'll sell a fraction of the ownership of that. It's, in a way, it's just like doing a short-term rental, except, and it's not a timeshare. It's kind of like a timeshare, but it isn't really a timeshare. They're actually owning a portion of that house. The resort communities particularly, Park City, Moab, Springdale, they were looking at this as being an issue whereby they're getting around the short-term rental regulations and restrictions. And so Park City in particular was in the process of adopting an ordinance that would have, in certain areas, prohibited this fractional ownership. There were some questions about the constitutionality of that. Legislatures kind of preempted all of that and now said you can't do that. You can't regulate differently, fractionally owned homes differently than you do any other home. So that's a provision that was included in there. And then you ought to be aware that there was a massive bill that established public noticing uniformity. It established a couple of categories for what kind of public noticing you have to do for the kinds of actions that you take, and it applies to everything all across state and local government. In the land use arena, all of the different kinds of notices that you have to do for land use actions, rezones, changing of your code or ordinance, adoption of your general plan, consideration of a land use permit. All of those noticing requirements now fall under one of these two categories, and so you need to take a look at that, what those provisions are and how that now applies to the kind of noticing that you have to do for any of the land use actions that you undertake. I know I'm going really fast on these, but we really want to get, oh, and then annexation, just want to let you know, there were some provisions that were changed on annexation with regard to, there was a definition of, or there was a category called rural residential property. It should have had, when it was adopted a few years ago, it should have had a property size restriction on it of 1,000 acres. For some reason, it was left off. What was happening is that we were starting to get small acre property owners of rural, defined as rural real property, agricultural kind of property, that were being able to stymie annexations. A single property owner could stymie a huge annexation. And that was not what was ever intended. That change was made along with some other provisions in the annexation code, as well as there was a mistake made in this particular annexation bill, which now we need to go back and fix, because if you look at the mistake, what it seems to imply is that you still have to get the sign off of all the property owners in an annexation area in order for it to move forward. So that's a mistake. That was a mistake. That was not intended, but it's there. We need to go back and fix it. All right, we're going to go back and talk about the subdivision process, and we're going to blend that in with our next session. So I'm going to ask Jordan and Daniel to come on up here. I think we have a couple of chairs. If any of our panelists, you know, Todd, you ought to stay up here because you were involved in that subdivision bill. Others, if you feel like stepping down, feel free, but stay if you like. And then we'll have Jordan and Daniel, because they are included with Gary as our panelists for the next session. And we're going to talk about the process for development reviews and approvals. And we're going to start off the discussion with a rather massive or a significant bill that was passed in this session about the subdivision process. Every jurisdiction is going to have to change their subdivision ordinance. You're going to have to do that because of what is in these bills. It was actually provisions included in 2 bills, most of them in 1. But with that, who should we have kick this off? Todd, you want to kick this off?
Sure. There's a rumor that I wrote this bill, and it's a lie. It's not true. We started talking about this idea in late summer, I want to say, Carson, last year, sort of internally with some of our city groups. And the reason we were talking about it is because there is, I think, a real perception that cities and towns are a problem, and not just a speed bump, but a roadblock in the development process. And I would acknowledge freely there are certain circumstances where that may be true. I think it is perceived more broadly than the truth that actually exists on the ground. But we were faced with situations where the governor stood up and gave a speech to a whole bunch of people, I want to say early fall, and he talked about the city problem, and he talked about he needed to find ways to get cities out of the way in the development process. That was kind of the environment we were working in, and internally we were talking about, is it true? And if it is, what can we do to fix it? And how can we resolve some of these things? And we started to think more broadly about our land use processes. And in this state, we make a very clear distinction between a legislative land use process and an administrative land use process. I know you talked about that a great deal last night. And in that element, we started to think about, are we kind of too much in our own way in the administrative land use arena? And as we reviewed where we were and talked to a lot of folks who are, planners, folks who are boots on the ground, a lot of elected officials actually, we came to the conclusion that even though the state has clearly delineated subdivisions as an administrative land use process, and that's been the case for a very long time. We started talking about that really clearly in 2007. And our case law has indicated that longer than that. Even though that's the case, we haven't treated it that way, and we haven't moved that way very successfully in this state. And we concluded that it was probably time to try and candidly, and I don't have a better term for it, see if we could push that along a little bit in a way that was meaningful. And we talked about standardizing the subdivision process across the state in a way that would, we hope, provide more efficiency in the decision-making on subdivisions, would provide a real emphasis and a clarity on the standard for subdivisions, and we hope over the long term may make a significant difference in our land use processes. So, because a subdivision is an administrative process, what that means is if an applicant comes in with a subdivision proposal and it meets your ordinances, you do not have the discretion legally to say no. That's the way the subdivision law has, I'm comfortable saying, kind of always been. That is not the perception of the public. When you put a subdivision on your city council agenda and it's for 100 lots, you'll pack a room with folks. And their expectation is that they can influence the decision of all the decision makers. It's not that they can point out things that need to be taken into consideration when the subdivision is approved. It is that we can influence our decision makers and we can get them to say no. And that candidly in some circumstances, and I don't want to talk about how broadly, but that candidly in circumstances has been a problem. And so this subdivision amendment proposal, where we're going to essentially a two-step subdivision process, is intended to address some of those issues. And the biggest features of this whole proposal, and this is the one that was the most difficult and controversial, but city councils are out of the subdivision business now. City councils do not hear and decide subdivision proposals. They are decided by an administrative land use authority at the preliminary plat stage, and we have a two-stage process for approvals now. You can do a preliminary application and a final application for subdivisions. At the preliminary stage, you can have your planning commission review and approve the preliminary subdivision proposal if you choose. As a city or town, if you choose, you can also have your staff do the preliminary subdivision application. The final subdivision approval has to be done at a staff level. I want people to understand how significant that is. In a lot of our larger communities, I don't think that's a big deal. And a number of them have been doing it that way for a number of years. But if you live in Virgin or Tokerville and you don't have a staff of 15 people, approving a final subdivision plat at a staff level without your planning commission is a big deal. So we're going to be talking across the state about how we actually implement that. I think it's going to be a challenge for our communities. But that's the reality of where this proposal has sort of come down. We are a two-step process. It's a preliminary and final plat, and our councils are out of the subdivision business. We, for a lot of years in local government, in subdivision and other land use approvals, candidly, have used a concept plan review stage very frequently. We bring a developer in, we require them to bring in it's not a back of a napkin drawing, but it's something pretty close. It doesn't have high-level engineering. Draw out your plat, bring it to us, and we'll run you through a concept plan approval. There are some communities that have done a public hearing on a concept plan subdivision at a planning commission and at a city council. And then a developer or an applicant is required to bring in their preliminary plat, and some communities are requiring public hearings at the planning commission and the city council on a preliminary plat. And then they do their final. And I am aware of some communities that did public hearings both places on those also. So you could have, at some point, if you ran your processes in certain ways, put 6 public hearings on a project that was entitled to approval from the start if it met your ordinances. We're hopeful that we have done something that actually will produce better development processes. I think over time that's where it will be. I think it's going to take some ramp up and some work to get there. And I acknowledge this is pretty significant stuff. But I'm hopeful this will produce better projects at the end of the day and better processes.
So I think maybe what we want to talk about next are some of the specifics that are required, the review process, which that's really the next slide that we have here. And it's another section that's been added to the LUDMA 604.2, which talks about the time requirements and so on. I'm trying to think, who's the best one to address that maybe really quickly? Is Daniel maybe the best one to address that? Have you incorporated that, Daniel? And then we can have the other participants comment on that. I know it was interesting to hear from Todd and some of the others, the process by which that was arrived at in the bill. But maybe Daniel can outline for us what the process is now required by the bill. Do you have that, Daniel? Is that appropriate, or would you be more comfortable having somebody else address that?
Yeah, maybe Gary. On
Okay,
that
Gary.
one.
Let's have Gary do that.
There are 2 dates that are probably going to be very, very important to everybody here. And one is, February 1st, 2024?
Yeah.
And the other one is December 31,
31st, right.
2025, isn't it?
2024.
2024 as well. And the reason for that is, one of the first things we had to negotiate was, we've learned from sad experience that it takes a long time for cities to put these things into place and for counties to put things into place. I remember after we did a redo about, 10, 15 years ago of the land use code, it took 10 years for some cities to actually adopt the redo of the land use code. So the first deadline, which is the February 1st, 2024 deadline, is for large cities and large counties. Well, yeah, large counties. And the second one is for the smaller cities. And so there's going to be a lot of, this is the Full-Time Employment Act for planners, certainly it is. But we need to let you know what we escaped as a result of doing this, right? Statewide preemption of single-family zoning, indicating that you could no longer have single-family zoning in any city in the state of Utah. That was one of the things that they were proposing, but that was the proposal. And when I say, I'm referring to Senator Fillmore took an opportunity at one of our league meetings in September to say something big is coming down the line for planning and zoning, and we're going to do it to you. Whether you like it or not, we're going to do it to you. And I think he was in shorts. He just finished golfing and a hat, and we all took him seriously at that point.
Well, and this is really in line with what's been happening in a number of other states around the country.
Exactly.
That's what's been happening.
Yeah, exactly. That's a total preemption of single-family zoning, saying it can't go anywhere. California is a good example. And so all of a sudden your subdivisions turn into two-family subdivisions, essentially is what ends up happening, or more. And so that was one of the issues. The other one possibility was that they would take all multifamily housing applications and treat them as instead of a legislative or administrative change, it would be a legislative change. That was the way that it was going to, no, it was the opposite. I'm sorry. They were going to take a legislative change, which is a zone change, and make them all administrative. Now, that would have gone over well with the courts. I think the courts would have said, no, come on, you got to look at what it really is. It's a legislative change and is subject to referendum. And that was to try and beat the referendum is what it was trying to do. So there were all kinds of attempts to try and pull together the big thing. And then the governor, on top of that, in his speech that he gave at the beginning of the legislative session, says, we're going to do something big to city regulation of zoning issues. You might remember that. And we're all sitting there thinking, well, what is this big thing? And quite frankly, they left us guessing till the very end of the session. Now, all that time we were negotiating in between, and you're seeing some of the negotiators here, but we were negotiating in between for something less drastic, but something that would accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. Their main focus, the legislature's main focus, is speed will produce lower cost housing. Speed in the application process will produce lower cost housing. That's the underlying premise of all this. And so with that, they laid out a process. We tried to lay out a process. We had probably, I won't say 100 meetings, but we had many, many meetings, online Zoom meetings, and we included planners, we included engineers to find out exactly how long it would take to do these things that they were recommending that we do. And I've got to tell you from the very beginning, because before you pull out whatever you're going to throw, that this is not a perfect process. And it's certainly going to require something more than a year to try and figure out. Because quite frankly, as I go through this, even Todd gave a presentation the other day at the league conference, and I listened to that presentation, and I was involved, and Sean Guzman were involved in the actual negotiations as well with Todd, and I thought, well, that's not the way I understood that. I wonder, how did that happen, you know? And he's going to say the same thing after I get done here in just a few seconds. So it is a process that is still in the works of being perfected, which I don't know that it ever will be perfected, but I think it'll work well, you know, once it's put into place. So the first thing we did was we asked, and I don't want to take too long in laying it out, but we like the idea of the concept approval. The developers are saying, said that concept approval is not necessary If it's just a standard subdivision, let it be up to us to go ahead and.
Can I interject one?
Yeah, please, I want you to interject all you can.
And
You
I'm,
get both sides of the
I'm
story.
bypassing Wade for a reason. Wade has a black hat on this stuff. But the reason why the concept plan was objectionable to the development community wasn't just that it was unnecessary. They actually like concept reviews in a number of circumstances, but what we know was happening, and this isn't just anecdotal, I've actually gone out and
It's happened to me.
seen the evidence, and Wade has the receipts. When they would go in for a concept plan review, every ordinance in this state says a concept plan review approval is non-vesting, which means, great, you got your concept plan approval, that doesn't mean anything. So they would bring their concept plan in, a city would look at it and say, we don't like what that result is, and they would change their ordinance after the concept plan approval. And
Or just the discussion,
and
as
I'm,
Gary knows.
yeah, and I,
You and I fixed it.
I'm sorry, but I can't defend that. You know, that's dirty pool in any circumstance. And so that's what led to a two-step that excludes the concept plan review.
Yeah, and quite frankly, please, if you're doing something crazy out there, stop it. Because quite frankly, that's the reason we're up here telling you about this stuff today, is because of the crazy stuff that occurred. I'm just going to, 2 seconds, right? The changes in the development agreement provisions came about as a result of a nutty thing that was done by a county up in, starts with W to the north, anyway. And it's not Weaver. Anyway, it really was a very, very bad thing that was done. And it's really hard up there to defend the bad things that we do. Like, for example, what they just talked about, to change the ordinance after you've got a concept plan where you know somebody's coming in and is kind of vested in that thing. And they think they're vested in that thing and they've spent money on it. Concept plans can be very, very, they can be pretty detailed and they can be pretty expensive to put together. And so you got a developer that does that, and then all of a sudden the city says, you know, we really don't like the idea that they're using this for open space. And yet your ordinance says that they can. Well, we'll change that, you know. So they change it before they come in for preliminary, and what happens? You get sued. You enter in. We end up in providing Wade with further income. Anyway, just real quickly, let me just go through the way that I read it. And Todd, please, and Daniel laid out a checklist for this, which he's going to tell you about shortly. But the bottom line is it begins with that, if the developer wants that preliminary look at what he's doing, and it can be on the back of a napkin. It literally can be that general, but it provides an opportunity for them to be able to have the staff of the city together to do a preliminary look at it before you actually get into the subdivision process. Then you go ahead and accept the subdivision application, you accept the fees, and you try to get what's called a completed application in place. And if you don't have all the stuff, the time clocks don't run until you've got all the stuff for a completed application. You have to clearly state what constitutes a completed application now. You have to have a list of those things that constitute, you can't hide the ball. Well, you know, you forgot this. It's, well, that wasn't anywhere in your, yeah, I know, but it's part of our completed application. You can't do that. You now have to be very express. You have to have a list of what constitutes a completed application. Once they've got that to you, then you begin first what they call a review cycle. Interestingly enough, there are two types of jurisdictions that were involved in this negotiation. One was the Salt Lakes of the world, and their process was completely different than Layton's, strangely enough, because their process involved, most of their work happens after the preliminary comes in. So you get a preliminary, you get all the application, and then you get a little bit of work to get to preliminary, but the majority of the work in Salt Lake happens between preliminary and final. That's where it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and final doesn't ever occur until finally, you know, they've got everything they need at final approval. And in Layton, it's just the opposite. We do all of our work. After we get the preliminary application or the completed application, we do all of our work in preliminary approval. And by the time it gets to the end of preliminary approval and you actually get preliminary approval, you really don't need a final because it is final. But we take it to the council or we take it to the planning staff, depending on what type of subdivision it is. If it's in a sensitive lands area is the only kind we ever take to the council. The rest of them are all approved by the planning commission. Well, Salt Lake was different. And so we had to accommodate both. There are some of you out there who, and developers are probably going nuts thinking, well, which one is it? You know, when I go to a city, what do I do? Hopefully this brings a little bit of order, a sense of order to that, because quite frankly, anything between receiving the preliminary application and your final approval, really it blends, because you can do it either way. You can take as much as you want, much information as you want, that back and forth. It can happen 4 times. The back and forth between the developer and the city can happen up to 4 times. But if you don't have your answers received in any one of those cycles, you don't have to move to the next cycle. You're allowed four cycles is what you're allowed. But if you don't get all the answers, for example, I do a preliminary, I get my completed application, and now I want everything that is needed for preliminary approval in Layton City. And they put it all together and they submit it. I have a time period. It's 15 days to review the application to determine that it's completed. And then I have a 20-day period of time in order to get the preliminary approval looked at. Everything they submit for preliminary approval looked at. My engineer loves to redline things, and he's going to send it back to their engineer. And their engineer is going to send it back to us with the changes. And we have a 20-day time period with which to do that. We can't go beyond 20 days in doing that type of evaluation, that preliminary plan evaluation. Business days. Business days.
Which is a lot.
Which we fought hard for, because originally it was just calendar days. But you can see the problems that presents. So you've got that 20-day period of time now that to get this back to the developer, and then the developer, this is a Sean Guzman provision. He said, well, if we got 20 days and we got to mark everything that we find to be wrong with your preliminary approval, we want you to refer to, we want the city, want to make sure this, and you want to make sure the city refers to everything in the code that actually references what you're asking us to do and what we did wrong, then we want the same thing from the developer. We want, now that he's got our responses to preliminary, we're going to give him 20 days to get back with us. And he has to document why he wouldn't comply with the things that we had asked him to comply with. Or maybe there's another way of doing it, you know, whatever it happens to be. The developer's engineer now has a responsibility, an affirmative responsibility to respond to us. Sometimes on both sides of the issue, you get our engineers that take a long time to review this, our staff, our fire marshal, our everybody else. But on the other side, sometimes it takes forever. In fact, probably my favorite trick in the development community is for the developer's engineer to always be saying, well, the city's taking so long to do this, you know, when really it's been in his pile for 3 weeks or a month or 2 months or whatever else. And sometimes the city plays the same game. So this will stop that game playing, hopefully, because it gives you time periods. So that cycle can go up to 3 times. In other words, back and forth up to 3 times. A couple little caveats is that if you've already addressed the issue in a previous cycle completely, you can't re-raise it in a subsequent cycle, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how that works or will work.
It's 4
Maybe,
cycles.
or 4 cycles, yeah.
4 review cycles.
I'm counting the
initial one.
the initial one,
Yeah.
the completed application. But there's 4 cycles total. The other thing is that in completing the cycles, at the conclusion of the cycle, of 4 cycles, if you still haven't come to a final approval, the development community wanted a deemed approved. And the cities wanted a deemed denied.
Right.
So we came up somewhere in the middle. We said, how about if we do this? How about if we take a panel of 3 experts if it happens to be a technical issue. And at the end of those 4 cycles, we allow those 3 experts to opine as to whether or not, if it's a street issue, whether or not you need a certain size storm drain, detention basin, whatever. Let's let this panel of 3 make the decision, and we'll go with that decision. If it's a planning issue, however, a density issue or something like that, or a phasing issue or something made like that, then it would go through the normal appeal process. And by the way, if during those 4 back and forths that you have, the developer comes back and says, we want to totally redesign the subdivision, we're in number 3. So, can you approve our total redesign in number 4? The answer is, if it's a total redesign or something significant, it goes back to number 1, okay? So there are some protections for both the city and the developer in this, and that's kind of what we liked. So I think that's probably, the final plat approval must be made, of course, as was indicated, by a planning staff member. And I apologize to you small cities. It's tough enough to get a planning commissioner. It's really, really tough to get a planner sometimes to work with you. And a lot of times you're using the county planner, but in the end, you've got to have somebody make that final approval. It can be 2 planning commissioners. It can
Yeah.
be 1 planning commissioner. It
You-
can be a staff
Todd has
member.
even suggested that it could perhaps be, include a mayor or a council member on that final review body.
Sure.
But just one of them,
Yeah.
or 2, no more. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, you can't.
Can't be a
city
council member,
council.
okay. All right.
Sorry, thought you were referring to planning commission, but it can be planning commission member, or it can be a staff member, either one. And, but it's just 1 person designated, and that's the reason I kind of lean towards the final approval being just a tap. Yeah, you got it right. Preliminary is, at least in Layton and most of the cities out there, is where most of the work happens. Salt Lake, I think for its own reasons, has a very light preliminary, but a heavy final. Yep.
I appreciate what Gary's saying. I see it a totally different way. For my clients, for the most part, I'm going to be advising them to do preliminary plats that are, for lack of a better term, planner heavy, the planning details. And the final plats, I'm going to advise to be the engineering heavy part of the process. That's the way I see it, and for most of my clients, I think that will work. For our small towns, like Gary said, it's tough. Those folks drive snow plows, they check sewer ponds, they do everything when they're council members. They're out of this process now, and that's hard. But the final approval of a subdivision plat, it won't change. A mayor still has to sign that. The mayor signing the final subdivision plat is not a violation of this statute. They're gonna have to sign it. But even in our small towns, when we look at subdivisions, our mayors have help from an engineer as a general rule, right? Our planning commissioners know the city ordinances, even if they don't have a planning staff. We can do this, it's just gonna take a little bit of an adjustment about how we think about it. Do I have to take a question from Paxton? Okay.
Thank you. I think this bill is a great step in the right direction, I really do. It's gonna be helpful to have standards that we follow. Question on your perspective on something though. I think we all agree that the plat review and approval process is supposed to be a purely administrative process, not legislative.
We all agree.
We all agree with that. So, and the question for an administrative process should be limited to, does the proposed plat comply with the existing code?
Right.
That's really it. And given that, my question is, why should we even allow 1 public hearing? What's the purpose of even a single public hearing?
You are not required to have a public hearing under the new statute.
But why not prohibit that?
So just so you know, I'll just tell you, when this bill got to the legislature, we had the 1 public hearing language in it because we had so much push, not from our side. From the legislative side, from the top down, from Senator Fillmore and Senator White.
Because they were hearing
who
from
were the 2
constituents.
chairs, who were hearing from constituents. It got labeled the 1 public hearing bill because they demanded a public hearing in the subdivision process. The public hearing has been out as a requirement for 7 or 8 years, I think. now.
But I think so many of the problems that we see in this plat review and approval process come from enormous public outcry.
That,
And the public outcry or clamor becomes a factor in the process, whether we like it or not, and it shouldn't be. I would love to see public hearings prohibited.
we
So-
have a presentation on that a little bit later today.
Yeah, we do.
Oh,
Make
okay,
sure you come to the afternoon session
But-
on
but-
public participation. We're going to talk about that a little bit.
But I would just say this one word, it's May, and Todd said that. So if you're a city, you'd be wise to not have a public hearing for a subdivision process, because all you're doing is creating your own headaches. You're creating that expectation that they can change something that they can't.
Question about the Land Use Authority. Do they have to follow the Open and Public Meetings Act? So if just staff and an engineer, so a planner and an engineer is the Land Use Authority, we have to have an open and public meeting when we approve or not approve something? Or
Yep, I
as-
think you do. I think that because you're a designated land use authority that will be established by ordinance, I think you are gonna be subject to the Open and Public Meetings Act. That's been going on for a long time in a lot of larger jurisdictions where they have agendas posted for a development review committee or a subdivision land use authority, you know, whatever it may be. That happens, and it is. So open up your conference room, right? And the public can be there if they choose and hear all the discussion, but
Just one more thought for the small communities, having worked in a few of those, that they really are using consulting engineers, right? And so they've got to adhere to those timelines also, right? No matter how much stuff they're doing for 20 other communities. I'm just wondering were they all consulted for this?
yeah, actually, we had a
Okay, because it strikes me as a lot of these communities are meeting once a month, maybe. And the 20 days is really tight.
Okay, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here. We've got less than 15 minutes left in this session.
Daniel just had a comment.
Oh, Daniel, because I wanted to go to you here
Yeah,
coming up.
great.
You and
Well-
Jordan, we haven't heard from the two of you, and
Yeah, well, I mean, one, I was just clarifying, the public meeting, the Open and Public Meetings Act is only applicable if there's more than one
person.
staff member. So if
Right.
it's just one staff, then you don't have that requirement.
Right.
But otherwise, I wanted to express my appreciation for being invited to join. It has opened my eyes and helped me gain a better appreciation for our local municipalities and the enormous task that everyone has. And I heard a joke once by Jim Gaffigan. He was asked what it's like to have 5 children, and he said, it's like you're drowning and then somebody hands you a baby. And I feel like that's very much analogous to the situation right now with the legislation that's come up. There's an amazing amount of standards and rules that our local governments have to be aware of and abide by, and that's really the goal that I've tried to achieve in the work that I've done in being invited to help, in providing some checklists and kind of an overview of the standards and requirements applicable for each of our application processes. So the handout that's been provided today is more a general summary with a classification of all the different application types to give a general overview, but more specific application or checklists and suggested best practices and resources for the relevant state statute as well as the appellate court opinions will be included on a per application type basis on the Utah Land Use Institute's website. So do keep an eye out for that. That'll be
yeah, if you haven't picked it up, it's out on the table out there. This is what it looks like. Make sure you pick that up.
Yeah, and to quickly describe this, basically it's separated into 5 different classifications. Really, I think it could be, rather than 1 through 5, it'd be 1A, 1B, C, and then, or B, and let me start over. 1A, 1B, and then 2, 3A, 3B. So 1A, 1B would be the administrative with a notice or meeting requirement and without a notice or meeting requirement. And then the second one is the quasi judicial. That's your appeals and your variances, and setting out the standards and requirements for that. And then the last is the legislative. And it's separated into two separate for the reason of identifying which ones require just the Class A notice that requires the posting to be to the state public notice website, your city or county's website, and to the affected area. And then the Class B notice has that same requirement with the addition of designated geographic areas if that has been designated in the state statute or city or county ordinance. And then when those specific applications are posted on the Utah Land Use Institute's website, the way that those are meant to be used, it's got all of the state standards outlined, so your notice requirements, the timeline requirements, but it's meant to be customizable to your local standards. So where you go beyond that in your city ordinances, if the notice needs to be to more people, it has a different timing requirement that's meant to be adjusted. So it can be a resource used both internally, and I think, as was pointed out a lot and emphasized yesterday, that the best practice would be clear communication, setting expectations for those that are part of the process. So it could be something that is posted and included on your city websites that does kind of clearly lay out, set expectations for your applicants of what standards they need to meet, what sort of timelines and other things that they'll be subject to.
All right, I want to give Jordan an opportunity. Jordan is the state property rights ombudsman, and he hears from a lot of communities and from developers and applicants, and give us a little bit of what he was planning on saying with regard to what he's seeing in the way of reviewing land use applications.
Yeah, thanks, Will. No, this has been a great conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of it. Essentially, what I was asked to do is so the Ombudsman's Office, our role is we're a neutral. We step in when we're asked to by one party or the other to help resolve disputes. A lot of the time we spend is really on the phone talking with people, and sometimes just the conversations we have, you know, it doesn't lead to any further involvement from us, but it gives people information that they can then take to help themselves, kind of thing, resolve their own disputes. I won't take too much time, but we just kind of in the office put together a list of things that we see, and I was asked to talk about, you know, what are some considerations that can help improve the land use approval process. So I kind of categorized them into some broad and overarching principles. A lot of it riffs off of what's already been said, honestly. The first one, fairness and due process. I think it was Gary who said, don't do wacky things. And honestly, I think that goes a long way. Participants need, it should go without saying, but it's worth saying, participants need to act in good faith and create an environment of trust. And also, a lot of the calls that we get are people just saying, hey, either we don't know who to talk to or we're not being provided access to who we need to talk to. Access is a big deal, right? If you want good development, give the property owners, the developers, access to the people they need to talk to at the time they need to talk to them in the process. The next one, clarity and predictability. Provide clear submittal requirements for complete applications. I really like that that's in the new process. It goes so far to have a checklist, and so the parties are all on the same page about what is actually required for this application. It reduces questions about vesting and different types of things. Lay out the clear process and path to approval. Identify the land use authority, how many meetings. Ensure your code language is clear, simple, and understandable. If it's not, if you're getting a lot of questions, or if there's regular occurrences where people are talking about how they don't understand something, change it, improve it, make it better. Emphasize bright line rules over vague and discretionary standards where possible, and if you do need standards that require fact-finding supported by evidence, make sure you're providing clear and objective decision criteria for how the land use authority is going to follow that. And then the next one is transparency. Providing notice and disclosure is huge. Tell all these things to the property owners and to the developers. I like the pre-application meeting. Provide that to discuss objectives with planning officials before they submit a formal application. And let them know if you consider that a vesting event or not. At least have that discussion, right? So that there's the legal question of whether or not vesting happens with the concept plan, but at least disclose to them whether you think it does or doesn't, and then let them decide if they want to take that risk. I think disclosure is huge. Disclose who the decision makers are. Let them know about state law provisions that allow them to make written requests for certain decisions about a complete out. You can ask for them to make a decision about whether or not an application is complete. And then you can also start timelines about substantive review. If you want to talk about details, give me a call. Disclose who's responsible for scheduling the application for next steps, when that will occur, provide notice of any deadlines, expirations, if there's discretionary decisions that are to be made, disclose the standards that are going to be applied by the decision maker in making those, give them notice and disclosure of appeal deadlines, any forms they need, and then I think it would be helpful, a shameless plug, to let them know about our process, right? A lot of times we get calls from people and we say, hey, yeah, we can help to get involved to resolve this dispute. And there's reticence sometimes on the part of property owners. They're worried that if they involve the ombudsman's office, there may be some sort of retribution, right? Let them know, hey, we welcome dispute resolution, right? And then the last thing is just efficiency. I really like DRC processes, development review committees, right? Don't make a process that is you have to go to separate departments and you don't know who you're going to, and because honestly sometimes I realize, especially small communities without a lot of resources, sometimes they don't really know what their process is. They're doing it just kind of on a case-by-case basis. So think about that, lay out your process, pull all your decision makers together, and provide applicants access to those decision makers through the development review committee process. So those are a few thoughts, and happy to answer any questions. So.
All right, we're just about to the end of time here. Do any of the panelists have any closing thoughts or words? Question here?
I have one. How are you going to pay for it?
Do you mean the process and making these changes, or?
You've got communities who are putting out the fire burning at their feet right now, and you've just added a whole bunch of stuff that's on the horizon.
Yep.
How are you going to pay for it?
Yep.
I think they got to loosen up on how we deal with some of those issues, because there's just everything you've added is a whole bunch of added work that the planners in our city that I deal with from the Planning Commission, they're overwhelmed as it is.
Yeah, it's a good point. And actually, while we were discussing this in the meeting we had last Wednesday, Cameron Deal just texted me as well, and I promised that I would mention this. There was some money allocated. The local government lobbyists were involved in making sure that there was some money set aside by the legislature that could be used to assist communities in helping to accomplish this vast amount of work that is now being required. You know, it's was it $7 million, Christina? Is that what it is? Christina, hang on. She's going to bring a mic so everybody online can hear this as well.
Morning, it's nice to see a bunch of you. I haven't met some of you, I hope to today. Christina Oliver, Department of Workforce Services, Housing and Community Development Director. We did receive $4 million to work with all of the communities to help them implement this process. This is the very first time the legislature has provided that kind of funding in order to help the municipalities meet the new code, and we hope it becomes the standard. The way that we're going to roll this out will be in combination with the AOG directors. Some of the more rural locations, we're gonna have different processes for each specific need. It's not just gonna be a one-size-fits-all. So we're working with the league, working with the Utah Association of Counties, the AOG directors, and many of you, and we'll come out with some resources to help you.
So, I mean, it's not a lot, And it won't accomplish everything, but it's a help, and maybe it's a start, we're hoping. We shall see. For some of the other things, like for the water element that's required in the general plan, there was some money allocated to the Division of Water Resources to do some of that work as well. So there are some pots of money out there. It's not a lot, but it's something.
Carson Eilers with the Utah League of Cities and Towns. I wanted to piggyback on that $4 million. There's a new program coming online soon as well. It's called the Local Administrative Advisor. So for the first time, the state will be providing ongoing funding for each AOG or Association of Government to have a, administrative advisor to help guide communities through some of these things. I think this will be really essential for a lot of our smaller communities off the Wasatch Front, but it's a big lift, plainly. For all of your communities, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to be costly, but this is the compromise that was struck. Local governments kept their legislative authority, but the state also tasked them with doing some more work, and so I think that's the reality of where we're at.
All right, we are at the end of the session. Let me just close it by saying a lot of this has been prompted by the issue of housing affordability. And the fact that we have a lot of things, including our land use processes, that are things that need to be addressed. And that's what the legislature is doing here. And that's what you see before you. A lot of this is being driven by the concern about housing affordability and what we can maybe do to help solve that problem. So with that, I'm going to end this session, give thanks to our panelists, and turn it over to Craig.
Excellent panel. Really well done. Just a couple of housekeeping items. For those online, thank you for your patience. We hope we've worked the bugs through that we had a little earlier. All the materials for this session are online. It's utahlanduse.org, the spring conference connection on the conference page. Materials are there, and streaming for yesterday's sessions is already online there. So we're doing our best to keep up with the online opportunity as well. But one of the things online too is a quick summary, a chart that shows a 4-step procedure that Nick Norris of Salt Lake City created for us, just to help show a flow chart. And that's available on this session's website. A couple of other housekeeping items. If you are a realtor and would like credit for this, you signed in this morning. Would you sign again before the end of the lunch hour? The Realtor Division would like us to monitor that attendance closely, because you have to attend the entire 7 hours to get any credit as a realtor. But then you get 7 hours of free credit. So we hope that works well. And then just one other housekeeping item. In these materials, ably prepared, and it took yeoman work for Daniel Metcalf, who was here on the end of the panel, to prepare these. These will be available, and again, this is part of the process we're using. All of these individual outlines of the law on each of these topics, funded by the Utah Division of Housing and Community Development and Workforce Services, again, to help facilitate the incredible work that has to be done. These are available generally, and then we'll be supplementing them with a specific checklist for each different type of application, like a conditional use or a zone change or a general plan amendment. All of that, we hope, providing a level of support to those who have to make these decisions. Just one thing I'd mention, in this there are 2 checklists that talk through the process of giving public notice. Because of a little bit of confusion about the legislation, this printed copy you have includes an item that says you need to post a notice in the local newspaper. That is not so. So any requirement to post in the newspaper has now been amended away, for what that's worth.